Welcome to another episode of the History Blokes. We're talking to you from Ngunnawal country. I'm Chris McComb.
And I'm Conan Elphick.
And today we're going to be discussing the polio epidemic here in Australia and the vaccine.
Yes, we are.
I'm looking forward to hearing about it, Conan.
And just a reminder to everyone to follow, like, recommend, worship, whatever it is you must do to make sure that more people listen to this podcast. And continue to be educated, Chris, about interesting nuggets of Australian history that we think you ought to know about. The reason I'd like to talk about polio today, Chris, is we're currently living in the age of COVID, where viruses are very much on our minds, as are vaccines. The sort of thing we're going to be looking at is I do want to talk a little bit about viruses at the beginning, because viruses are weird. They are super weird. We'll talk a bit about that, the hideous effects of polio and the terror it caused at the time, the controversial and strong-willed Australian nurse who defied medical authorities to improve treatment, the two remarkable American scientists who finally came up with the vaccines, how Victoria let the country down on the whole vaccination thing. That's just in there just to get at you.
As they would, Pat.
Yeah,
as they would.
Because I don't want to be too harsh on Victorians, but I think it's safe to say that they're the lesser of all the six states, and aren't they?
It's because I'm Victorian, isn't that right, Conan?
Yeah, it's just maybe we should secede from them is an idea, and also how Australia contributed to the worldwide elimination of polio. But before we do that, Chris, someone said to me the other day, Conan, your podcast is the most outstanding podcast I've ever listened to. If it could be improved in one way, maybe stick in a quiz at the beginning. And I thought, yes, that's an excellent way to humiliate you, Chris.
Sure, Conan. Well, why don't we get on with the quiz?
Yeah, well, so all of these questions will be answered in the course of the podcast.
I'm all ready for you.
Excellent. Good. So my first question to you, and indeed to the listener, is, apart from polio and COVID, can you name 3 epidemics that have afflicted Australia since European colonisation?
I would guess the Spanish flu, because let's face it, that's been sort of front and centre when we're talking about the COVID epidemic.
Yep.
COVID pandemic, clearly.
No, you can't do COVID.
I can't do COVID.
I just said you can't do COVID. You can't do polio or COVID.
Okay. Something else that has clearly affected Australians over that time.
So, there are various pathogens that can cause infectious disease. What are they? So virus is an example.
Indeed. Viruses and bacteria. Mm-hmm. And third one is like Cryptosporidia. I can't recall what the actual type, what the genus is.
Polio helped give rise to what allied health profession?
I'm going to put it down as... I don't know.
Great. What unpleasant contraction is most associated with polio?
Crutches.
Sure.
Leg braces? Yes. Okay. Contorted, painful.
I will. I'll give you that, but when you hear it in the course of the podcast, you'll go, God.
Okay.
The Victorian education system has let me down again. And finally, the final question: what were the names of the 2 men who invented the polio vaccine? And
you've got me there. I don't know.
Okay. Good. Okay. So, polio was one of the most frightening diseases to affect Australians during the 20th century. It was incurable, it was unpredictable, and it mostly targeted children. This is what made it so frightening, and particularly as it could cause permanent paralysis and even death. It reached epidemic proportions here and around the world. But before we get into this specific virus, let me tell you some nuts stuff about viruses. You may know, for instance, that they don't really constitute a living thing. So whereas a bacterium is a cell, it respires, it reproduces, it consumes and expends energy. That is not true of a virus. It's barely alive. It reproduces, but they're not cells, and they don't require energy.
It's a little piece of DNA just sort of floating around.
Yeah, essentially, and they're even more microscopic than bacterium. They are tiny compared to those. So a pathogen is a microorganism that can cause disease. There are about 1,400 human pathogens have been described. whereas it has been estimated that there are 1 trillion microbial species on Earth. I'm getting this from a great article that was published by the University College London Genetics Institute, and I put the link on our notes.
I feel like we're severely outnumbered here.
We are severely outnumbered, Chris. It's if they organise, we're finished, and I suppose in a sense, certain species do. So 1 trillion microbial species on Earth, the vast majority of which we know nothing about. But happily for us, of those 1 trillion microbial species, only 1 in a billion is a pathogen. So that's reassuring. But but to give you a sense of the sheer quantity of the individuals, a litre of surface seawater typically contains more than 10 billion bacteria and 100 billion viruses.
Gosh, I was actually at the coast on the weekend, and I reckon I swallowed probably about a litre of seawater during my very poor surfing attempt.
I see. The number of viruses on Earth is believed to be about 10 to the power of 31. So 10 with 31 zeros.
That is extraordinary.
Or was it 1 with 31 zeros? Anyway, that's roughly 10 billion times the number of stars in the universe.
Absolutely unbelievable, isn't it?
The average human is made up of 30 trillion cells, and the same number of bacteria live on or in us.
Yeah, I would argue we're probably carrying around kilograms of viruses as part of our being.
Yeah, it's mostly bacteria. So, I feel the desire just to wash. Polio is a virus that is found in the gut, and it's spread through poo and ingested orally. So through poor hygiene, you can ingest it and spread it, of course. The problem is, as far as humans are concerned, this is terrific for the virus, but bad for us, is that it's incredibly contagious, partly because most people don't show any effects, and the first person to become paralyzed might not do so for many weeks after they become infected. So it can, or rather after a community has been infected. So it can spread throughout a community for ages. Much of the community might have it. They're shedding the virus in their feces, passing it on with their hands. Luckily for humans, so most people either show no symptoms or they get flu-like symptoms. Only about 1% of those infected have experienced any kind of paralysis, usually of the legs. And of those 1%, only 5 to 10% die. On the other, so that's great odds if you
so sort of 1 in 1,000, 5 in 1,000, in that sort of range.
Yeah, so it's but the trouble is it spreads throughout a community like wildfire, particularly when there's sanitation isn't. And this is what caused so much concern throughout the various epidemics in the 20th century. More than 50% of cases are children under the age of 3. An additional cruelty of polio is that about 40% of patients, once they've recovered from the paralysis, because often you do, it's not necessarily permanent, they might get it later in adulthood in what's called post-polio syndrome. Here's a supplementary quiz question. So there's one famous person in the 20th century history who did get polio who wasn't a child at the time.
Roosevelt.
Yes, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was paralyzed throughout his 3 or 4 terms in office. So he's in a wheelchair that entire time because of polio. Yeah, and he only got it he swam in a lake, his country house or someone's country house. He just went for a swim, came back that evening, he felt a bit unwell, went to bed, woke up paralyzed. Completely from the waist down, and remained that way for the rest of his life. Chris, polio goes back to the ancient Egyptians, presumably well before then. It's a very ancient disease, but it wasn't sort of identified until the late 18th century, and it was only in 1908 that it was identified as being a virus.
I mean, when you think about it, I mean, our understanding of viruses and bacteria and so on, and the causes of disease, was pretty rudimentary prior to that time.
Yes, so people really had no idea what was going on. And we might get to this later in the intermission. I know you're going to talk about some weird medieval and ancient cures. But what can be certainly said is that, I found a cool word in my researches. Are you ready to hear this?
I'm absolutely ready to hear this word.
This word is iatrogenic harm.
Iatrogenic harm.
That is harm caused by a doctor inadvertently while trying to treat you.
Wow.
That really was the defining feature of medical care right up until the late 19th century.
And the defining feature of lawsuits.
Yes.
In the late 20th century.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it was only in the late 19th century that you were better off going to a doctor than not doing so. Up until then, you were better off avoiding them because they were going to bleed you.
Probably drill a hole somewhere that where one shouldn't exist.
Exactly. So if you had smallpox or pretty much anything other than a broken leg, you were going to experience some iatrogenic harm. And so, as I said, it was only at the turn of the 20th century that they began to realise. Well, Louis Pasteur came up with germ theory in the mid-19th century when he recognised that pathogens were the cause of infectious diseases, which until then had been thought to be caused by the four humours. Have you heard of that? The ancient Greeks, like Hippocrates and
there was things like yellow bile and
black
bile,
phlegm and blood.
That's right.
So the idea was that you are only ill as a result of these four humours being out of balance. So part of the reason you were bled is it's considered there's too much blood going on. So, I mean, this was just obviously insane, but it was concocted by the ancient Greeks and adhered to up until the mid-19th century, up until Louis Pasteur.
That is incredible. Like these concepts, despite being clearly odd, hung around for 2,000 plus years.
Yeah. But on the other hand, if you don't know microbes exist, and they didn't because microscopes didn't. Okay, so polio was known in Australia by the late 1800s, but the worst epidemics took place in the 1930s and the 1950s. Between 1944 and 1954, it was responsible for more than 1,000 deaths. So I suppose, looking at comparing that to, I suppose, COVID, I can't rattle off the figures for COVID deaths. That might seem kind of mild, but we have to remember that a lot of people were permanently paralysed. Yeah, and part of the issue was that people didn't know exactly what caused it. They knew it was viral, but they didn't really know how it was transmitted. It was associated with poverty and with dirt, but that actually really wasn't it. It affected everyone. And it wasn't really until the 1950s that it became clear that it was transmitted via feces. Although perhaps we should say poo-poo.
I think for the purposes of this family show, that makes sense to me.
There might be children listening. Yes, and when people didn't know when it was going to break out, it usually occurred in summer, and it would cause public hysteria. Swimming pools would be closed down, theatres and cinemas were closed, and people avoided large gatherings, even though, of course, that had nothing to do with it, unlike COVID.
And were government restrictions imposed at the time?
Yes, that's exactly what they did. Now this is where things get a bit grim. So if you're diagnosed with polio, what happens? Bearing in mind mostly it's children. And of course they weren't super sure what caused the spread, as I said. So if you were infected, you were often isolated in infectious diseases wards with other kids. And because your limbs had been paralysed and usually caused a contraction of the muscles, what they would do is strap you into braces or into splints, which were quite uncomfortable, effectively immobilising you. You could be there for weeks or months, unable to interact with members of your family. So you can imagine this would have been... And then you faced many months more of rehab after that.
Were they waiting... I mean, what would be the trigger point? Were they waiting for the muscles to relax and for them to be able to get around semi-normally to a point where they could interact again with the real world?
Yeah, well, that's right. Where they're able to sort of more or less walk, usually with calipers, sort of a brace thing on your legs. But they were convinced that the best way was to immobilise the limbs until such time as you were able to walk around to some extent. And the reason why you generally recovered is because the nervous system, because basically the virus is happier. Remember, it still exists, so I can talk about it in the present tense. It is happiest in the gut, but sometimes it gets out into the nervous system and can damage various nerve pathways. And what your body is able to do is find workaround. But it takes a while for that to happen. Some remain disabled for life, having to get about on crutches or calipers. As I said, some died. In some cases, the disease affected the nervous system to such an extent that you weren't able to breathe unassisted. So, and while nowadays, if you find yourself in that situation, there's sort of portable respiration packs that press your diaphragm in and out and enable you to breathe. They didn't have that then. And so you were put in, and this is the answer to the question that I asked you earlier.
The iron lung.
The iron lung.
Of course, I knew you were going there. You'd mentioned breathing before, I would have gone straight to iron lung.
So I didn't spoon feed you enough. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah. So the iron lung, so it's a massive contraption. Anyone listening to this, please Google iron lungs images, and you'll just see these vast tubular constructions made out of steel and glass. The child, usually a child, was inserted in this, and only the head stuck out the end. So the pressure inside the iron lung would change, enabling the sort of force the breathing to take place. Most of the time, after several months, they would be released from this and able to leave.
After several months
It can be several
in
months.
this contraption. That is incredibly scary for a child, for anyone.
Yeah. What's particularly horrifying is that on some occasions they would never leave. In 2009, a woman called June Middleton died at the age of 83 in Melbourne. She was the world's longest surviving polio patient in an iron lung. She had been there for 60 years.
An iron lung
Yeah.
for 60 years.
Went in at the age of 23, prime of her life, never left.
That is astounding.
Yeah.
That is absolutely astounding,
It's
for
dreadful.
sure.
It's dreadful, isn't it? And this is where we get to Elizabeth Kenny. So she's the Queensland nurse I mentioned before. In 1932, she started providing treatment to polio patients, mostly children again, not who had severe polio like that, but whose legs were paralysed. She rejected this idea of splints and whatnot. She was more into rehabilitation through warm compresses and massage, trying to stimulate muscle movement. So, and such was the popularity of this treatment, that she set up various clinics around Australia and England. And she spent 11 years in the US, where she was greatly lauded. And in fact, she's considered to be one of the forerunners of physiotherapy for treating this kind of thing. But she was a very controversial figure. So there was a lot of members of the medical establishment here and in the UK felt that she was exaggerating some of her claims, or that the basis of her treatment was unsound. But this is what sort of makes her interesting. She was, bear in mind, this was the 30s and 40s and 50s. She didn't take no for an answer. She was an immensely tough individual. She wasn't even really a fully qualified nurse, but she was absolutely convinced that the treatment she was providing was superior to anything else that the medical profession was providing. So much so that she could be tender and caring to a child in a bed one moment, and then turn to the doctor who was treating the child and give them an absolute earful. She was not taking anything lying down at all. So she has to be sort of considered to be one of these very impressive 20th century women.
Dare I say, she was a disruptor.
She was very much a disruptor. And in fact, in the US, she was so lauded that they turned her life into a biopic in 1946.
That's fantastic. and clearly there was you need people like that to change the culture of a profession like the medical profession in this case.
Yeah. So at this stage, Chris, I think we should take an intermission. And by the way, an intermission here does not mean you, my dear listener, leave and make a cup of tea. It means you listen with rapt fascination to Chris talking about medieval treatments and whatnot. And it's been suggested to me that we begin and end the intermission with what's called a musical sting.
All right, Conan. Well, it's time for intermission, which is the time when we get to share some fun, interesting, weird, and sometimes creepy facts related to the subject at hand. In this case, I'm going to be talking to you about ancient and medieval cures. So let's start with cataract surgery. A cataract is essentially the slow clouding of your lens caused by aging, trauma, and exposure to UV. So there's a whole range of risk factors, but essentially it's going blind over a period of time.
And it's the most common cause of preventable blindness. So donate to the Fred Hollows Foundation.
Hear, hear. But look, cataract surgery, would you believe, goes back to ancient India. So 6th century BC, where they developed a technique called couching. So when you'd be going blind because of the cataract was forming, they'd essentially get a long, sharp instrument and poke that into your eye very, very slowly and push that lens into your vitreous inside your eye. But of course, having no lens, your vision would still be blurry.
Yeah. Yeah, well, for the benefit of the microphone, both Chris and I are blinking uncontrollably at the thought of having sharp objects stuck in our eyes, and I'm sure you are too at home.
Indeed. And, you know, this technique was basically kind of practiced all over the place for some 2,400 years, up until the mid-1700s, where a French surgeon, Jacques Daviel, introduced basically a variant on couching, where he'd make a small incision in the side of your eye and take the lens out. So whilst the result would be the same, you'd end up with a blurry vision, certainly better than being blind, but the lens would be removed completely versus potentially interfering with your eye from inside your eye.
Right.
And really, things didn't evolve until the mid-1900s. It all goes back to World War II, where a World War II flying ace with the Royal Air Force called Mouse Cleaver went on a mission, and he forgot his goggles.
Not much of an ace if he forgets his goggles, Chris, may I just point out.
A rookie mistake indeed. So anyway, he got shot up in combat, and bits of his plastic canopy disintegrated on fire and spread splinters everywhere, embedding in his eyes. Yeah. Even under these conditions, on fire and bleeding, he flipped the plane upside down and parachuted out of the plane to the ground, and of course into surgery. He did lose one of his eyes, and the other eye had this plastic canopy embedded into the eye, so splinters of canopy. And then this doctor noticed that over time his body didn't react to that plastic. That gave him the idea that he could perhaps replace the lens with plastic, and he went on eventually to work with the petrochemical company that developed the canopy to develop lens-specific plastic material and perform the first surgery in the late 1940s, essentially, which is just fascinating. Let's move on then from cataracts to the treatment of hemorrhoids. How do you reckon in medieval times hemorrhoids were treated, Conan?
Well, Chris, I'm a stranger to hemorrhoids, or at least I'm going to remain non-committal on the subject. But I would assume that, as per now, you might see a commercial and it would involve a man or woman in some kind of discomfort. Then they learn of a product at their local pharmacy. They pop over there, purchase it for a reasonable price, and then pop it up their bum, instant relief.
Unfortunately, no. And here I thought you were going to say leeches.
Leeches would work. Why wouldn't leeches work?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. I suspect leeches may have worked, well, certainly may have been tried, but we don't have any records to demonstrate their use.
I guarantee they were tried.
Leeches for everything.
Yes, leeches for everything. Definitely that.
Take 2 leeches and see me in the morning.
Yeah. Pity the leech!
In fact, medieval manuscripts have shown that they've treated hemorrhoids through the application of a hot cautery iron. In these manuscripts, there's an image of a surgeon standing behind the patient who's bent over.
Well, then we should use this word surgeon with massive air quotes.
Indeed, probably borrowed from the Spanish Inquisition, I suggest. Standing behind the patient is leaning over clearly with a surprisingly relaxed look upon his face.
Yeah.
And so they would effectively cauterize the hemorrhoids.
Ugh.
I guess it would treat it.
With essentially like a hot poker, I suppose. It's kind of what you're suggesting.
Dare I say the cure is probably worse than the disease in this case.
Ugh.
Well, let's move on to the very last.
Let's move on.
Trepanning. Have you heard of trepanning?
I have heard of trepanning, yeah.
Okay, so trepanning, listener, is actually drilling holes into your skull. And this is a technique that was practiced very, very widely around the world. A hole will be drilled into your skull to cure things like epilepsy, perhaps mental health issues, or simply because you just acted a little bit differently to everyone else.
Yeah. Ugh, that sounds grim. I've seen the results of that. You can see it at various museums. So in Copenhagen, I think it was, you can go to the museum there and they have skulls from the Viking era that show people who've been trepaned. You can tell very quickly whether that particular person has died from the trepanning process or survived it, because the trepanning holes in some cases are just sort of jagged holes, probably about the size of a 10-cent piece. And in other cases, you can see that the bone has fused over time, that not completely together, but it's sort of smooth and rounded. Yeah, so clearly people were capable of surviving it despite the obvious risk of infection. But what's weird is that I can only assume that getting trepaned would make many of those things a lot worse, particularly the mental illness. So you would have thought that the people conducting these procedures would think, trepanning doesn't work. Let's stop trepanning.
I suspect there was a lot of money to be made, or power to be bestowed upon undertaking.
And I'm sure there was lots of rationalizations around why the trepanning didn't work in this particular instance. So wasn't it to do with evil spirit? They believed that evil spirits was...
Indeed it was. It was. I mean, fundamentally, it was about drilling a hole in your head and releasing the evil spirits that were causing you to act oddly.
Yeah. So maybe they just felt, you know what, we're going to have to do another trepanning because obviously the evil spirit was reluctant to emerge from the skull. Let's just keep on drilling those holes. No, I mean, it's crazy. It's just appalling. Thank God we live in the 21st century.
Thank God indeed. And I think that's the end of our intermission, Conan.
It is. And now it's time for a musical sting. Okay, we are back with the solution to the problem. So what do you do when you've got what is in effect a pandemic, a series of pandemics sweeping the 20th century, not just the developing world, but the developed world? You come up with a vaccine, we did that very quickly and remarkably with COVID. It took a while longer with polio. And this is where I'm now going to reveal to you the names of the two remarkable men who developed quite separate vaccines. They were both from immigrant families who had moved to New York. Either their parents did or they did as a child. Both studied at New York University, medicine there. One was Jonas Salk and the other one was Albert Sabin. I think that's how you pronounce it. They didn't work together on these vaccines and they developed them independently. But contrary to the era's prevailing scientific opinion, it was generally believed at the time that you needed at least what was called an attenuated virus, or weakened virus, in order to stimulate an immune reaction. But,
similar to the smallpox vaccination.
Yes, that's right. But Salk believed he could do it safely with and effectively with the dead one. So he administered the vaccine to volunteers who had not had polio, including himself, his lab scientist colleague, his wife, and their children.
I presume that they were volunteers, not volunteered.
Oh, well, yeah, but I mean, does a child get much say?
So I think there might be a slight ethics question there, I think.
Different times.
It would have been a real problem if you'd actually injected them first and then waited for the result.
Well, quite. In 1954, there was a national testing campaign done with 1 million children ages 6 to 9 who became known as the polio pioneers. And in 1955, in April, the results were announced that it was both safe and effective. So to give you an idea of how effective it was, in the 2 years before the vaccine was widely available in the US, the average number of polio cases was more than 45,000 a year. By 1962, that number had dropped to 910. What's impressive about it is that he never patented the vaccine, never earned a cent from his discovery, just wanted it to be distributed as widely as possible.
And we've seen that approach to this type of science, those sort of treatments, again and again, fortunately, over time.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a nice quote from him. You might find it cheesy. I like this quote, though. So the quote from him is, "Hope lies in dreams, in imagination, and in the courage of those who dare to make dreams into reality."
Very nice.
A bit self-aggrandizing, but he's forgiven. I would encourage anyone listening to Google Larry David stand-up. It's one of the episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm. He does a series of stand-up sketches, and one of them is where he's talking about how unpleasant it would have been to live next to Jonas Salk's mother. I won't ruin it, just have a listen. Anyway, so this was followed in 1961 by an oral vaccine, which was developed by Albert Sabin, who was actually born... Oh my God, I said it! I said they were both Russian Jews. They're not! He was born in Poland.
If you want to, we could just redo that.
No, I'm happy to. I want people to realise I'm fallible. I'm not some omniscient podcast being. Yeah, and the interesting thing is that Salk got onto vaccine for polio eventually, but Sabin got straight into it. As soon as he graduated from med school, he went straight into trying to find a vaccine. And he did a similar thing. So he and his research associates ingested the attenuated viruses just to make sure that it was safe. And he developed and tested the vaccine in the late 50s. And I should just point out at this stage, anyone who's a bit cautious about vaccines, and of course that's a debate that's raging with the whole COVID thing, there's no doubt at all as to the effectiveness and safety of polio vaccines. And in fact, combined, they are estimated to save 600,000 lives a year worldwide.
That is incredible. Given the debate that's occurred over the last couple of years as well, I think in some ways it's really important to reflect on the successes that we've had in this space. Leaps,
yes,
really.
Yeah. And it was produced here in Australia by the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. The Australian involved was Dr. Percival Baisley. We should give credit to him because he went to work with Salk from 1952 to 55 to work on how to manufacture it over here. And they were first distributed in Australia in June 1956. Many parents were enthusiastic, Chris, about the vaccine, but not everyone. And so that's an interesting mirror of the COVID thing. However, by 1964, 83% of New South Wales children were vaccinated, but only 72% of Victorian children were.
They're really dropping the ball there.
Yeah. And that's not enough. You don't get herd immunity from 72. And it's for that reason that another outbreak of polio took place in 1961 and 62. So, for the benefit of the microphone, Chris, can you hang your head in shame on behalf of your entire state?
I know you can't see me, listeners, but I am hanging my head in shame right now.
Come on, you're not doing it. Hang your head in shame. That's it. Okay, so Sabin's oral vaccine was introduced in 1966. By October 2000, the World Health Organization declared the entire Western Pacific region, including Australia, to be free of polio. That said, there are 400,000 polio survivors in Australia, many of whom are still living with the long-term effects.
It's a huge percentage of our current population.
Yeah, that's 27 million people. 400,000 is a lot. And in terms of Australia's contribution to polio eradication, this was actually the result of a Queensland accountant called Sir Clem Renouf, another tricky to pronounce name, who was then world president of Rotary International. And he decided to launch an eradication program, polio eradication program, similar to that which had eliminated smallpox. And if you're familiar with that program, that was a determined effort by the World Health Organization to completely eradicate smallpox from the face of the earth.
And it was successful.
It was completely successful.
Incredible medical achievement.
Yeah.
Absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. And so, yes, it no longer exists in the wild as a result. And so he wants
just in Russian bioweapons labs.
Yes, exactly. And America has one too. Has a lab that is super secret and secure that also has it. But so he determined to do the same thing. Rotary raised $247 million in the 80s and began work in South America. And then the WHO joined in when they realized Rotary was meeting with success. They got involved, and in 1988, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was kicked off. And what this has resulted in is that now polio has been eradicated in all countries except Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Incredible. And might I say, that's another feather in the cap for Queensland.
Oh, yes, I did say.
You mentioned the Queensland accountant,
yes,
and we talked about the first state to abolish capital punishment.
Yes, that's right. My God, Queensland comes out on top, Victoria on the bottom. Is this going to be a recurring theme, I wonder?
We'll wait and see in future episodes.
Let's just assume that at the very least Victoria will be at the bottom. Yeah, but there still is no definitive cure.
It speaks to how critical the vaccine option is.
Yeah,
in this case.
So everyone, don't slack off. So this brings us to the end of my blathering, Chris. We can now return to the quiz and see how atrociously you performed.
Oh, did I mention the bubonic plague?
You didn't mention.
Damn it!
So yes, I would have accepted smallpox, bubonic plague, obesity.
Obesity.
Yeah, that's an epidemic.
Come on! It's an epidemic, but it's not really in the same vein of what we're talking about. Yeah,
it's a killer. It's a killer, Chris. It's costing the health system a fortune. Spanish flu, you did say that. There's also Asiatic flu, HIV,
of course,
measles, and scarlet fever. Okay, so that was the first question, so fail. The second question was, there are various pathogens that can cause infectious disease, and I said viruses, you said bacteria. You mentioned Cryptosporidium, and during one of our pauses, you remembered it was protozoa.
That is correct.
So protozoa are a form of parasites, which is apparently a pathogen, and the other one is fungi. The other pathogen is a thing called prions, which I had never heard of. They are a sort of misfolded protein that affect the brain and cause neurodegenerative disorders like mad cow disease. Had you heard of prions before?
No, I haven't. Certainly heard of mad cow disease, but not prions.
No, prion sounds like an electric car.
I suspect it might have been.
The Nissan Prion. Polio helped give rise to what allied health? So you didn't. I
didn't get this at all, did I?
Yeah. So no, you didn't get that. That was, as I said, physiotherapy. Elizabeth Kenny. What unpleasant contraption is most associated with polio? Yes, you just in the nick of time, and I will give that to you. And the two men who invented the vaccines
didn't have a clue.
Yes, you didn't. Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin. You know, they were classic examples, weren't they, of immigrants making an enormous contribution. So Russia's loss was very much America's gain, and not just, and of course Australia's gain. We have all benefited.
It's nice actually to attract those people versus stealing them after the Nazi war machine collapses.
Yes, that's right.
But look, I think this is very topical. I think the discussion today, and particularly given where the world is regarding COVID-19 and the vaccinations that I think have been incredibly successful both here in Australia and overseas. Yeah, but reflecting on the history of vaccination, the history of our successes, I think is important now more than ever. But this has been really interesting, Conan.
Yeah, and it's the thing about COVID is we knew immediately that it was a virus. We knew how it's transmitted, broadly speaking. You know, and then of course we got that vaccine. We got safe distancing. All of that stuff was sort of rolled out very quickly. Polio was at a time and within living memory where they really did not know what to do. All they knew was that it was a virus, but beyond that, they didn't know how to avoid it, and there was no vaccine for many, many years. And that was just one of a number of diseases that was going around because, you know, antibiotics wasn't really rolled out until that period of time either. So, Chris, it's been great chatting about this. It's been great chatting to the listener.
Thank you very much. And look, thank you all for listening again. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with podcast number 3. Look forward to speaking to you all then.
Talk to you then, everyone.